we turn to a topic that hits us all right in the heart, and that's judgment. Oh man, judging others. The ways that we are judged by others, the way that we judge others, something that nobody in this room has not been victim to or perpetrator of in our lives, right? Right? We've all been the victims of judgment. We've all been on the receiving end. We've all been in a place where we're struggling with it. Maybe we've been the judgmental. Maybe we've been harmed or hurt or put down by someone we would deem judgmental, and then find ourselves in the seat of the judge ourselves. Whatever it is, judgment is something that Jesus talks a lot about. And in the Sermon on the Mount, he gives us a perspective on judging others that is really, really powerful for our lives. So I was thinking about this today, just how much judgment can affect us. Like here I am, I'm drinking out of a plastic cup with a plastic straw. If I saw myself and I was in the audience, I'd be like, doesn't care about the environment. What a loser, right? This guy, who does he think he is? What's he doing? And, here I am. So I'm asking you, don't judge me, all right? Because judgment is one of those harsh things. It's hard for us to shake. Last night, Lindsay and I went on a date, and we went to a restaurant here downtown, and we took a Lyft downtown. We took a Lyft back home, and the Lyft driver picks us up, and he's like, okay, so it's 9:30. Where are we off to next? And I said, next? We're going home. Going back to the suburbs. And he's like, oh, yeah, sometimes it's surprising to me, pick up young people, take them home at 9:30. Then I'll pick up a grandma in your neighborhood and take her downtown. And I was like, geez, I was feeling the receiving end of judgment a little bit, like, oh man, are we lame? What's going on? But that whenever we're judged, whether it's outwardly or inwardly or secretly, it affects us. And it affects us at a very, very deep level. I recently saw a clip of The Bachelorette. I know, I don't watch it, it's sinful, but I saw a clip of it, and they were talking about this girl was going on a date with a very evangelical Christian guy, one of the Bachelorette contestants, and she was railing against him because he was standing up for his faith, and she was like, no, like, you can't judge me, don't judge me, I don't need your judgment. And then she walks off the screen, and it's this big dramatic moment. It cuts to commercial. And I was like, man, doesn't that speak to the heart of what a lot of us feel? So many of us, and maybe it's particularly our society, but I don't think it is. I think it's a very human condition that Jesus spoke to. We don't want to be judged. We don't want to be judged. Part of it is fear that we don't want to be seen, but the other part of it is we don't want people passing judgment on us for what we're doing. It's just so sensitive. It just cuts right to the depth of who we are when somebody looks at you and says, I think you're this kind of way. And you go, what? How can you make that call about my life? You don't know everything. You saw me for a few seconds, or you saw me in this instance. How can you make that call on my entire life? But then isn't it so easy for us to turn that back around on others? It's exactly in this tension of judgment that Jesus speaks to us about the predicament of being judged and of judging and extending judgment to others. When in the Sermon on the Mount, he says this. Jesus says, do not judge so that you won't be judged. Do not judge so you won't be judged. For you will be judged by the same standard with which you judge others, and you will be measured by the same measure you use. Why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the splinter out of your eye, and look, there's a beam of wood in your own eye? Hypocrite, Jesus says. First, take the beam of wood out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the splinter from your brother's eye. Don't give what is holy to dogs, or toss your pearls before pigs, or they'll trample them under feet, turn, and tear you to pieces. The effects of judgment. Haven't we all felt that at some point? Maybe it was when you were growing up in school. Maybe it was for the way you dressed or the way you acted. Maybe it was at a job that you have had in the past, or maybe it's at a job that you have now where your boss laid into you in a performance evaluation. You go, whoa, what happened there? Maybe it was a teacher that you had that called you out at some point. Maybe it's from a parent. Maybe it's from a friend. Maybe it's from a cousin or some other relative. We've all been on the receiving end of some judgment in our lives. I'm willing to bet if we ask ourselves, we've all been the one to dole out some judgment on others at some point in our lives. Maybe it was yesterday. Maybe it was last week. Maybe it was this morning with your wife or your husband or your kids, right? We all do it. We all engage in this behavior. It's so central to who we are as people. Think about the nature of growing up. How many of you went to a school where you walked in line? Did anybody go to a school where you walk in a line with other kids? Right? The teacher lines you up, especially when you're very little. When you're like 5 or 6 years old, you have to get from place to place, and logistically, the best way for the teacher to do this, to make sure all the kids are there, is to line them up so she can watch and see, okay, every kid is still in this line. Who gets to go to the front of the line? The good kids, right? That's actually like one of the best rewards that you get very early in life, isn't it? Hey, Paul, you get to be line leader because you're quiet and everybody else is raising a ruckus, right? Or it's, hey, Lindsay, you go to the back of the line because you're so bad. So it starts right there, age 5. We decide who gets to go to the back of the line and who gets to go to the front of the line, and we start judging each other and measuring our place in society, and the horse race begins when we're 5 years old to determine who gets to go where in line. And we never get out of it. We stay in that line. I was reading this thing about conversation starters, how people enter into conversation, and the most common question that people ask when they're entering a conversation with somebody new in America, this is a poll of Americans, is what do you do? What do you do for a living is what people mean when they ask that. Because once you know what somebody does, you know exactly where they stand in relation to everybody else in your life. Like, oh, you're a teacher. Oh, my mom was a teacher. Great. Or, oh, PhD. Wow, you're like up here in society, right? Or, oh, you're a medical doctor. You're the highest of society. Or, oh, you're a politician. That depends on what you think personally, right? Are they the lowest of society or the highest, right? But we ask this question and we form a line. It's just like the lunch line in school. And we go, okay, well, where am I in relation to you in this line? Am I more like leading the line? Or am I behind you in line? Where am I going to put you in my line? Right? And Jesus gives us this warning at this very early portion of Scripture. He says, the judgment that you use for others is the same judgment that will be turned back to you. Folks, I'm telling you, if you're living this way, where you're putting people in line, guess what everybody else is doing to you? Putting you in line. Judging, right? The way that we judge is the way that we are judged in return. The biggest fear that we have is not the judgment of God, it's the judgment of others. Because we are so accustomed to the extreme judgment that we can levy against one another, right? We don't even know what the judgment of God is like. We're so used to the judgment that we dole out or receive from one another that we get caught up in a fear, not of God, but the fear of man. Where am I in the lunch line? Jesus has a scene of judgment in the Gospel of John. A woman is brought to him in a courtroom setting, actually. The place where it says that he was in John, this scene in John, he's standing in this courtroom place right? That would have been a place where they would have brought senators and they would have debated arguments and they would have discussed with one another what gets to happen to criminals. Jesus happens to be speaking there, and the Pharisees bring to him a woman caught in the act of adultery. And Jesus' response to this woman is not quite like the kind of judgment that we would do. In our court system, we would say, okay, well, have the check marks been checked for the offense? What is the sentence? Where in the line does this person fall? Are they they just get put behind the line leader, or do they get sent to the back of the class, metaphorically speaking? And for this woman, she was at the back of the class. A woman caught in adultery was to be stoned under Levitical law. Yet Jesus does something very different. He doesn't call out the woman on her offense. He calls out the crowd on their judgment. He calls out the crowd for placing themselves in the seat of the judge, which belongs only to Jesus. So once all of the crowd people are gone, all of them have left their condemnation because Jesus calls them out on their judgment, asks them to set down their stones. What does he say to the woman? He says, "Who stands here to condemn you?" She says, "Nobody, Lord." He says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." See, Jesus, I think, was reorienting this lunch line. Jesus expressed a very different kind of judgment, very individualized sort of thing. He was focused on the heart of people, not on the societal scale. And one of the biggest offenses to God is when we put ourselves in God's shoes to judge other people, to stand in the judgment seat, to take over the seat of Jesus. It's the thing that's almost most harshly condemned in the Bible. The Pharisees and the Sadducees experience this often, as Jesus calls them out on standing in God's place. And he tells you, look, the measure you use to judge others will be judged back to you. So my first lesson for you is this. When we think about judging others and we think about judgment, that fear that boils up in us, it's not fear of God. It's fear of ourselves. We fear judgment because of how we judge others. And we should be afraid of that because we judge others pretty harshly, don't we? We can judge others pretty harshly. Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, he takes it a little bit further and he says, do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven, something I preached about last week. Give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. With the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Jesus is preaching something that we all hope is true. He is preaching to the people something that we all wish in our hearts of hearts was true. But we grew up in a judgmental society with judgmental people judging us, and we fear that, and we become that, and we judge others. And we don't believe what God is actually saying. We don't believe the message that Jesus actually gives us, that we are free of judgment from everyone but Jesus. That Jesus will stand before us as judge. And the way that Jesus stands before people as judge is just so very different than the way we stand before others. He stands before this adulterous woman, the worst crime in Israel, apparently, if it leads to death by stoning. I can't imagine anything worse than that. And yet, he tells her, I don't condemn you. Church, maybe that's a good starting place for ourselves. What if we saw ourselves the way God saw us, uncondemned? And here's the real kicker. What if we saw our neighbor the way Jesus sees them, uncondemned? I'm on Facebook all the time. And on Facebook, judgment rears its ugliest head. Have you guys ever just like scrolled through your news feed and you see something and every once in a while a political ad pops up and you click on the comments with like 74,000 comments and people are like, I don't know if I really agree with this. And it's like, you should die. Like things take a harsh turn on Facebook. So much so that like I walk around society and I'm like, geez, I wonder what that person's like on Facebook. You know? I encounter somebody at the store and I'm like, yikes, I would hate to see what's on their wall on Facebook, right? That judgment just comes right out. It's just right on the surface, and it just proves what we do. We're playing the line game, y'all. We're measuring each other up, and we're trying to force people into positions in our line. We go, no, well, our line is over here. You need to come over to our line because we're going to the lunchroom first. And if you don't, then you don't get any lunch. So come over to my line. And you have to stand behind me because you don't really get it. This is what we do on Facebook. This is what we do in society. This is what we do secretly in our hearts. Because if it's coming out right there on your Facebook wall, guess what's right there in your heart? Just under the surface. Maybe social constraints are keeping you from yelling at somebody in the grocery store, but the internet can't hide that. It just comes right out. And that's what Jesus speaks about when he talks about the second portion, where he says, do not look at this beam that is in your eye. Do we have that verse? Why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the splinter out of your eye, and look, there's a beam of wood in your own eye? Jesus calls them hypocrite. First, take the beam of wood out of your eye, and you'll see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's eye. This is a very important teaching for us. It's a very important teaching for us because, you see, we're very concerned with what is fair. I think I have a slide for this. We're concerned with what is fair. God is concerned with what is just and what is right. It's really interesting in the Hebrew, the word fair doesn't really exist. There's a word for justice, but there's not really a word for fairness. Fairness is a concept that is developed out of English that's derived from justice and has to do with something being right in our own estimation, right? Fairness is something that any parent can immediately relate to if you have two kids. Because if you have two kids, at some point, someone's going to say, well, why'd they get to do that? That's not fair. Or if you're a teacher, you recognize this. Kids do it all the time. Well, I don't understand why I have to abide by this rule when so-and-so doesn't. That's not fair. Have you guys encountered this? Has anybody played the fairness card? Say like, well, I should have this job because that's what's fair. Or you need to pay me this. That's what's fair. I know I play it all the time. I'm interested in fairness, not necessarily justice. What is right, what is good. That's all that God cares about. And God could care less about fair. God could care less about fair. He cares about what is right and what is good. His judgment is very different. We put people in these lines. Jesus sees one line, and he says, all of you have issues. There's nobody with more or less issues. You all have issues. Every single person, the person you walk by on the street, has issues. The person inhabiting your house with you has issues. The person you are raising to be another adult has issues. The person who raised you to be an adult has issues. Everybody in your life has issues, but at the same time, every one of those people is loved by Jesus. The line is flat at the ground of the cross. All of those issues look the same to Jesus, and all of those people are equally loved by God. The ground is flat. Nobody has a bigger splinter than the other. Everyone needs a little bit of eye surgery, right? We all need a little bit of eye surgery. We need to pluck something out. And Jesus says, don't be so concerned with what is fair, Be concerned with what is right. And the right thing is that your heart is aligned with God. Lesson number 2 is this. Jesus asks us first to judge only ourselves. You're not asked to judge anybody else. You're not asked to receive judgment from anyone else. In fact, Jesus clears those people out of that woman's life in Israel. He says, all these judges, don't listen to them. What matters is you and me. Where is your heart with God? What is in your heart? That is the thing to judge. Don't be so afraid of the mirror. Look in the mirror. Do you have a speck in your eye? Do you have a beam of wood in your eye? It makes no difference. Both of it needs to come out for you to see clearly. I was thinking about this the other day. I was doing some yard work and I got something in my eye, and it's like the whole world stopped. This was like several weeks ago. I had to take my gloves off, and I was like, oh my gosh, I think I got like a big shoot of wheat sticking in my eye or something. I was weeding, right? It kicked something back into my eye. I walk inside, there's like nothing in my eye at all. Can't find anything. But a speck of dirt, shaft of wheat makes no difference. It messes up your eyes, right? That's what Jesus is talking about. We need to look first to ourselves. Big issue, small issue, no difference. The line is flat for Jesus. The line is flat. And there's a really good parable that illustrates this. In Matthew chapter 20, Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven. And he says, this is how heaven is. Heaven is like a landowner who's hiring people to come work in his vineyard. Anybody heard this parable before? This landowner goes out and he offers some people at the very beginning of the day 1 denarius to do the work. Later in the day, he still needs workers and he's having trouble finding people. So about noon, he offers the same daily wage, a denarius. People come out, they work. And at the end of the day, there's still work to be done. He hires people for a denarius, they work, they're done. Well, they line up to get their pay at the end of the day, starting with those who came last. And they accept their payment and they walk out. And then the people in the middle of the day accept their payment and they walk out. And the people from the beginning of the day who've been working in the back-breaking heat of the Israel sun, farming for this guy, collect their 1 denarius, just like the people who showed up 20 minutes before the time card punched out. And they say, wait a minute. What do they say? This isn't fair. And the landowner says, fair? You agreed to work for me for a denarius, didn't you? They go, yeah, well, but we didn't know they would also. And he says, doesn't matter. The agreement was a denarius. Denarius for a denarius. Judgment for judgment. You are paid according to what you give out. Jesus says, this line is all equal. Could you imagine if we had this perspective, church? Could you imagine what Facebook would read like if people thought that way? It'd be very different. I might actually enjoy the time I spend on Facebook a lot more if we all saw in the way that Jesus saw. Everybody receives equal payment. What is agreed upon is what is agreed upon. We all have issues. We're all loved. We all get to accept that from Jesus. I was thinking about heaven, and I was like, you know what's interesting about this? Heaven is like a lunch line. That lunch line that we hate when we're lining up as kids, or the one where you'd love if you get to go to the front of the line. But the interesting thing is, the lunch line for Jesus is backwards. In fact, the best people end up eating last. The whole point of that parable that Jesus tells in Matthew 20 is that the last will be first, and the first will be last. And I was playing this out in my head and thinking, what does the lunch line of heaven look like? We're all hungry, and there's the best food in the world right at the end of the line. It's the best food you can ever imagine, and you're so hungry, just longing to get there. But God says, well, you can only get there if you let people cut. Who would you be uncomfortable letting cut? Think about it. In your lunch line, when you get to heaven and you're in the lunch line with Jesus, who gets to cut in that lunch line? Who would it be unfair to let ahead of you? That's exactly what heaven looks like to Jesus. People are going to cut. People you think don't deserve to cut. People you know for a fact shouldn't even be in the line. Yet, that is the exact picture that Jesus gives of heaven in Matthew 20. People are cutting you in the lunch line. Who is going to make you uncomfortable in that scenario? That's the speck in your eye. It's the thing that Jesus is speaking to in us. I know there are people I don't want cutting me in the lunch line, but if I'm interested in living in heaven, I got to get over it. I've got to get over it. If I'm interested in the kingdom of heaven like Jesus is, I got to get in line with him. Because the thing I can guarantee you about that lunch line is the hands on my shoulders will be Jesus. The person at the back of the line will be Christ himself. The picture he paints of heaven is one where the Savior of the world waits in line with everyone else. The last will be first, and the first will be last. It's a beautiful picture of judgment. So, what does this have to do with that confusing teaching at the very end of this section? Jesus talks about throwing pearls before swine, and it goes like this. He says, don't give what is holy to dogs and toss your pearls before pigs, or they'll trample them under their feet, turn, and tear you to pieces. We know this. This is a Facebook example, right? You give someone some advice like, oh no, I don't know, I think that taking probiotics is fine. And it's like, probiotics are the devil, here's an article, here's 2 more articles, here's 3 more articles, go to the library, and you should be ashamed of yourself, and I hate you. Angry face emoji, right? It's like, well, no, I was just asking if we should take probiotics, right? Or like, I don't know if I really agree with that policy. If you don't agree with this policy, you can get out of America, I'm gonna come to your house and take you. Like, okay, well, sorry for disagreeing humbly. That's throwing your pearls before swine. People can be so harsh. The harsh judge isn't God. The harsh judge is us. God's judgment is just. Has to do with you. Has to do with you and your heart. Our judgment is ridiculous. And Jesus wants us to draw that distinction very clearly in the Sermon on the Mount. He wants our judgment to turn back on itself. Rather than lobby that judgment out on others, judge yourself. Look to yourself first. Look to your heart. Where are you with God? Where are you in the lunch line? Where are you in life? That's what matters, not what this other person is doing. In fact, at the end of the Gospel of John, Peter talks to Jesus and he's like, well, what about this guy? What are you going to do with him? After giving Peter basically a death sentence. He says, hey, you're going to follow me for the rest of your life, and your life is going to be a lot of suffering, but you're going to build the church. And Peter's like, okay, well, what about this guy? He points to John. And Jesus says, who cares? It's not about that guy. It's about you. Our relationship has nothing to do with John and I's relationship. Forget it. In fact, if you care about that, that will take you completely off track in life. Like throwing your pearls before swine. Think about the imagery of that. I have a dog who eats like a pig, right? She'll eat literally anything. Like the other day when we went to the park last Sunday, I was kind of walking her around, Lindsay and I were trading her off, and she got into some chicken bones, which are like horrible for dogs. But she's picking at these chicken bones, and I'm trying to fish them out of her mouth, right? Like, no, don't eat that. It's so futile. Trying to get a bone out of a dog's mouth is like, I don't know, trying to deliver a baby on a helicopter or something. It's just, you might as well just not worry about it. So she eats a chicken bone. Imagine that futile imagery here. Give your pearls to a pig. Imagine reaching in a pig and pulling those pearls back out. Trust me, you don't want to do that. But we do it all the time. We play these games all the time. In fact, rather than focus on our relationship with God and building good relationships, we spend 90% of our time trying to repair relationships that have no repair. We spend 90% of our time focused on people that are just never going to get it when there's someone right outside who's like, I want to join your men's group. Who says, I could use some help. I would like to know more about Jesus. I would like to, be your friend. But instead we're focused on like, man, I wish I could be friends with Gina. She's so cool. But she just doesn't like me. Well, Rebecca's like, can I be your friend, please? But we spend a lot of our time throwing our pearls before swine, don't we? We spend a lot of our time playing the judgment games that Jesus wants us not to play. We spend a lot of time putting somebody on the pedestal, removing them, and then climbing up on the pedestal ourselves, right? I just watched an episode of Modern Family, and Phil, the character in Modern Family, was watching Mean Girls, and he's like, that's how I'm going to get my father-in-law to like me. I'm going to Mean Girls him. And then Jay Mean Girls him back. And it doesn't work. They're Mean Girls-ing each other, and they don't connect at all. But when they set all of that judgment aside and they're honest with each other about their relationship actually becomes a lot stronger. It's the exact same thing that Jesus is talking about here. We spend a lot of our time in the judgment game, in the line leader race. Where do I get to be in line? Who gets to be in line? Who's in that line where? We spend our time on Facebook. I see some of these Facebook posts, and I'm like, how long did that take that person to write? How long did that Facebook message take? And it's 100% hate for an hour and a half of somebody's day. And the person receiving the comment is not going to reply. They're going to move on with their life. So if you're doing that, just stop. It's not worth your time, right? And that's exactly what Jesus is saying. If you're going to let judgment beget judgment in your life, just let it go. Don't give to dogs what is holy or toss your pearls before swine. Don't worry about that stuff. The only judge that matters is Christ. And the only actions that you should be judging are your own. If you're caught up in judging anybody else's, you're missing the point. You might be missing God. Jesus gives a picture of God in Luke chapter 15. He actually talks about a number of kingdom parables, about what the kingdom of heaven is like. And the last one is the most palpable, the most powerful, the one that we can most reach out and touch because it connects to all of us, about a father and his two sons. In Luke 15, he talks about this prodigal son, the son who takes his inheritance early, goes off to the big city, wastes it, becomes jealous of the pigs because he wants to eat what they're eating because he is so poor, and he wants to come home. And when he wants to come home, the father has this thought about him. The father says, so he got up and he went to his father. The son has had enough of living in this horrible lifestyle. But while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran, threw his arms around his neck, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven, and in your sight, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father has no time for that. He says, hey, stop everything. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Bring robes. Bring the family signet ring. Put it back on the son. He's home. My son, who is a long way off, has come home. And we're going to have a party. Jesus says that's what God is like. The Old Testament is full of a bunch of conflicting ideas, but Jesus is the full revelation of God, as it says in Hebrews, as Paul says. Jesus is the full revelation of God, and he reveals God to be something that people never got before, that Jesus is God, and that God is like a heavenly Father, and that heaven is a lot like this. You've come home, judgment suspended. Let's celebrate this. But we live life in a very different way, especially with others. We see them like the other son. See, because there's a son who lived with his father and never left, never did any of the sinful stuff, never did wrong. And that son is stuck outside the party. That son, at the end of the story, it says this. The son is rebelling. He goes, I'm not going to join your party for my loser brother. And the father says, son, you're always with me. And everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. God's judgment leads to mercy. Our judgment leads to more judgment. Lesson number 3 is this. Jesus wants us to catch that it's not our job to judge. We're not the judge. Jesus is judge. It's very clear in the Bible. Daniel saw it. Ezekiel saw it. The revelation of John attests to this. Jesus himself says, I am the judge, not you. You don't get to be it because I am the judge. It's his job. Our job is to love, to live like Jesus. Our job is to live like Jesus. Our job is to get to know the judge, not to be the judge. Not to worry about the judgments of others, but to worry only about the judge. Our job is to live like Jesus. And so I want to leave you with a couple questions today. As we think about judging others, I want you to think about, what is that line like in your life? Who would get to cut? What's the Facebook rant that's bubbling up in you? What's the speck in your own eye? What is that thing that needs to be removed? What is that judgment that needs to be cleared out of our hearts so that we can be closer to Jesus? So that we can love our neighbors like Jesus called us to. So that we can know God the Father, not God the Facebook ranter, not God the mean girl, but God is the judge that he really is. Can we take the weight? Can we take being cut in line? Can we take being last? Can we take being with Jesus, who said, the last will be first? What does that mean in your life, church? What does it mean to hear these words from the Sermon on the Mount, that the measure you judge will be judged against you? And keep that in mind with that prodigal son, the father, receiving both older son and younger son, as long as they're willing to set aside the speck in their brother's eye, the speck in their own eye. What does that look like for you? Let's pray. God, thank you so much for giving us this beautiful message on judgment. Thank you for reframing it. Thank you for allowing us an escape from the swine and the dogs that would eat us or tear us apart. Thank you for suspending the judgment of the world for us to focus on living life in heaven, to focus on clearing out those specks in our own eye so that we can see you and see our brother and sister clearly. Lord, thank you for opening up a new way to live, to bring heaven here, to start living a new kind of lunch line. Lord, thank you for giving us this message. May we live it in our lives. Thanks be to God. Amen.